Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 16 in the history series, Who Wrote Art History in the Renaissance? I'm just going to talk about three authors because they exemplify a lot of the things that are important for understanding art history as it was understood in the Renaissance. First of all, Vasari. So Vasari was primarily a painter, but he also wrote the first book in Europe on the history of art since the Romans and Greeks, which means that in Europe that was the first book in about 1,500 years. The book is called Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. It was first published in 1550, and there is the title page of the second edition. It's actually just part of the second edition because it's a really long book, and it was often published in different volumes. In some editions, it's 3 volumes long. So it's actually bigger than the big textbooks of world art history that are contemporary textbooks, and it's also bigger than most academic books would be allowed to be because Vasari didn't have any editors or publicists telling him how long or short he should write. His book has woodcut portraits of the artists he talks about, but it doesn't have any illustrations like the one I put in below. So that's his woodcut portrait of Paolo Uccello, the painter, Florentine painter, as you can see right under his head there. That's what it says, and one of Uccello's paintings there. And so it tells the history of Italian art from Giotto up to Vasari's own generation. I give a couple of examples of the kinds of stories that Vasari includes. So here's his portrait of Botticelli, Florentine painter, as he says. So he does describe artworks, usually much more briefly and informally than you would expect in contemporary writing about art. But he also tells these gossipy stories. He does a lot on the biography of the artists, as he knew all the ones in his own generation, and the others were only 2, at most 3 generations back before him. So he has lots of stories about them. So, for example, in the case of Botticelli, he interrupts his life history that he's telling of Botticelli to tell this anecdote about how Botticelli couldn't concentrate because he had a really noisy neighbor. I can't remember what it was that the neighbor was doing that was making him so noisy. He was working with machinery or something like that. Anyway, Botticelli decided that in order to make the neighbor be quiet, he would take an enormous stone and balance it on the wall between their 2 properties so that if the neighbor continued to make noise and cause vibrations in the ground, the stone might crush him. It's impossible to know if that's true or not. It's sort of clever, but then the stone could also crush something on Botticelli's side of the property, whatever. It doesn't seem relevant to the work at first, until you start thinking about how perfectly balanced Botticelli's figures are. So often in Vasari, things that seem anecdotal or biographical start to make sense if you think about them. Not always, but often. I give one more example about this from Vasari. So this is, that's a detail of a painting by Piero di Cosimo, who was an artist who painted some very eccentric scenes of animals with human heads. You can see a couple of them in the center of that detail, one on the left there, some animals of indeterminate species with human heads, and there's forest fires in the background. And they were strange paintings. In Vasari's generation, nobody really knew what they were. The artist wasn't around anymore to ask, and these paintings they weren't sold in any systematic way to galleries, so there's no titles and so on. And of course, there were no art historians around to write about them. It turns out that Piero was trying to imagine the creation of the world, the way it might look if you don't follow the account in the Bible, but you read Greek and Roman classic texts instead, because they have other accounts of how the world began. So this is part and parcel of the Renaissance, to read these texts and to use them to question biblical narratives in this case. This is a detail of another one of Piero's paintings, just to show you how strange they were. It shows a fat, naked man who's fallen down. On the left, you see him falling from his, I guess that's a donkey. He falls down, and then some people are trying to get him up again. One of them is trying to pry him up with a stick using as a crowbar, and then there's these other 2 that have made themselves into a kind of human chain. So really kind of crazy stuff, and it turns out this is actually from a Greek myth about Silenus, who is the overweight friend of Bacchus, the god of wine and so on. And Silenus was greedy and had tried to get some honey from a nest, and it turned out that it was, well, he got stung and it fell down. And anyway, it's an obscure story, and since the painting didn't have a title, it seemed very enigmatic at the time. So Vasari says Piero painted, quote, curious fauns, satyrs, wood nymphs, children, and bacchantes, followers of Bacchus. The diversity of creatures being marvelous, with various goatish faces, all done with grace and remarkable realism. In other words, he didn't really know what Piero was doing, but he thought that he would tell these strange stories about him because they connected with strange stories about Piero's life, which he also told. So here's an example of the way he describes Piero himself. Quote, he neglected his material comforts, and his habitual food consisted of hard-boiled eggs. He would cook not 6, but 8 at a time, but a good 50, not 6 or 8 at a time, but a good 50, and he would eat them one by one from a basket in which he kept them. The crying of babies irritated him, and so did the coughing of men, and the sound of bells, and the singing of the friars. When it rained hard, he loved to see the water rushing off the roofs and splashing onto the ground. He was much afraid of lightning and terrified of thunder. He would wrap himself up in his mantle, shut up the windows and doors of the room, and crouch into a corner until the fury of the storm passed. His conversation was so various and diversified that some of his sayings made his hearers burst with laughter, but in his old age, when 80 years old, he became so strange and eccentric that he was unbearable. He praised capital punishment, saying it was a fine thing to go to death in the open air amid a throng of people. And thus he went on with these most extraordinary notions, twisting things to the strangest imaginable meanings. After such a curious life, he was found dead one morning at the foot of the stairs in 1521. So that's fairly typical, and the notion here is that the weirdness of the paintings, which actually it was Vasari's fault, he didn't understand them, but the weirdness of the paintings seemed to be explained by the weirdness of the life. These are examples of Vasari's sense of biography that is not part of art history anymore. So Vasari's book divides Italian art into 3 stages. There are also 3 generations. The first stage is the rough beginnings at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, when Italian art woke up in the Renaissance, Rinascimento, the reawakening of art, when artists were first learning to make naturalistic pictures. And so Giotto is an example of that. The figures are strong, but they're still awkward. The landscape is unconvincing. The expressions aren't subtle. You may recognize this from the Ages of Man model of history that I talked about in one of the early history lectures. The second generation, or the second stage, is the perfection of art. And that's the period later called the High Renaissance, the first few decades of the 16th century, 1500 to 1520 or so. And the prime example is Raphael, where the figures were fluid, the landscape's convincing, the face is expressive. Also following the kind of, almost following the Ages of Man model. And the last of the 3 generations or stages, according to Vasari, is Vasari's own generation, including Michelangelo, which he says added, quote, graceful and sweet ease, charm, delicacy, and above all, an almost indescribable manner, in Italian maniera, to art that was already perfect. And one of the examples is Pontormo, where the colors are said to be very refined, a lot of secondary colors actually. Figures are elaborately twisted and attenuated and so on. In the 20th century, this kind of late Renaissance style was called mannerism, and that's an echo of Vasari, his idea of the manner, by which he doesn't mean that it was mannered. He doesn't mean that. He means that it had a manner, it had a grace that was, in a sense, beyond perfection. So this is the life history model, more or less, that the art of the first period is like childhood, full of promise and awkwardness. The second is near perfection, like adolescence and maturity. And the third is perfection, like adulthood, and something beyond perfection. The life model gets a little fuzzy at the end there, because the second and third stages could both be thought of as adulthood, and the third stage is definitely not old age. Vasari also says that history is like the classical and medieval idea of the wheel of fortune. that things fall like Rome did, and then they rise again. He said that ancient Roman art had been perfect. That's a photo of the Pantheon of Rome, which is one of the best preserved ancient Roman buildings. But Vasari said after Rome, art began this long, sad decline, and that Italian artists had to start from scratch. And the word he used to describe what they did is Rinascimento, Renaissance, literally translated. Rebirth. So Vasari is the first Western writer to look back in history from his position and see a gap. This is the most important thing about Vasari's innovative sense of history. This is a picture I found on Pinterest, which I think unwittingly follows Vasari's schema. It's not really meant to, but it does, because the way that this person drew this graph makes the Middle Ages lower. So art goes up to the Roman Empire, and then when the Roman Empire falls, art falls. And then there's the Dark Ages, the medieval period, and then up to the Renaissance again. That's actually very much in line with the way that Vasari imagined things. Before Vasari, people saw art as a kind of unchanging thing, that artists painted and sculpted God and biblical stories and so on. Vasari was the first person who looked into the past and saw that something was broken. So it's this gap or gulf or break or division in history that is the crucial insight or perception that Vasari articulated in his book that makes it so important for the history of art, because it's a simple thing, but it's very subtle. Maybe it's even profound. The difference between people who look into their past and see a kind of like a parade or a street or just something stretching into the past, and people who look into their past and see a break, a gap, something like that. Vasari doesn't say anything about what would happen in the generations after his own, because I imagine that he didn't want to think too much about it, because it was his own Wheel of Fortune model or the implicit life history parallel would both make the future seem pretty dire, because what happened to ancient Rome is that he says, Vasari himself said, it couldn't deteriorate any further. So if the third period that Vasari was in was like maturity, then there's nothing left for the people after him, including his own students, by the way, except old age and death. So in the book, he avoids that by talking about increasing perfection. Would be a nice candidate for a psychoanalytic analysis if such a thing hasn't already been done. Okay, second writer that I want to talk about is Bellori. Giovanni Bellori, Lives of the Modern Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. Title, of course, echoing Vasari's. This is a 17th century text. It's roughly a century after the Renaissance and roughly a century after Vasari. This is the first book to explain how different places, still in Italy, but different places, had different styles, and so did different artists. Because for Vasari, all artists are trying for perfection or for maniera, those in his own generation. But after Bellori, art historians realized, people who wrote about art realized, that individual artists and individual regions, in this case regions and city-states of Italy, might be headed in different directions. So I'll show you examples from Bellori. These were all the most famous artists in Bellori's day. Poussin, my first one, is still famous, still in all the survey texts. The next couple ones may not be artists that you would run across in your survey, but from Bellori's point of view, these were the most important artists. And he assigns each one of them a quality in which they excel. He doesn't actually talk about styles, and he doesn't talk about regionalism. That's a much more modern idea. But he talks about qualities and virtues, things that these artists could do, each one could do differently from the others. So Poussin, this one, Bellori says was the best artist scholar. This is a painting called Dance to the Music of Time. It's an allegory, it's full of literary allusions. Poussin's work is full of myths and legends and so on. He was a scholar in many ways. Rubens, also very much still in the textbooks, Bellori says was the preeminent court artist, which is quite true. He had a very successful career in a number of European countries. Domenichino, now a little bit less famous, so he's apt to be not in the survey text unless you spend time on the Baroque. Domenichino had the greatest artistic imagination. He was able to imagine scenes like this. And the fourth of these is Lanfranco, who Bellini said was the best painter of nature for landscapes like this one. So the idea of this is that art history is made of different, what are now called manners and styles, what he would have called ideals or virtues. And that is also a seminal idea in art history that's very much still with us. And it's a precursor of our contemporary idea of pluralism. These days, we say that you don't say that your art is better or worse than the person in the studio next to yours because we have a pluralist environment. This is the origin of that. The idea that Lanfranco is not worse than Rubens, it's not worse than Poussin, but they all have different qualities. The last of these is Karl van Mander. So Vasari wrote just about Italian art, and Bellori included some places that were influenced by Italy, but still mostly Italian art. But outside of those regions was the entire of Northern Europe. And of course, outside of that, Asia, Africa, and the Americas and so on, but they were not included in art history until the early 19th century. So at this point, just after the Renaissance, Karl van Mander is an important figure because he was the first one to attempt to compete with Vasari or to write a complementary text to Vasari's by writing about the history of art north of the Alps. He's Flemish, and there he is with the title page of his book. So here's an example of the way that he writes. Joachim Patinier, a painter, a northern painter, had a certain individual way of landscape painting, most subtle and precise, the trees somewhat stippled, in which he also painted deft little figures so that his works were much sought after, sold, and exported to various countries. He had the custom of painting a little man doing his business in all the landscapes. He was therefore known as the shitter. Sometimes you had to search for this little shitter. So to end this, I thought I might show an example of this little man doing his business in another painter, not in Patinier, but another northern painter of the same period, Bruegel, who van Mander also writes about. So the innovation of van Mander is not to notice that some of his painters like to hide little people and doing their business in the landscape. The innovation is that he's decisively stepped away for the first time from Southern Europe and opened the way for art history to look at the rest of the world. So here to end is a little, it's a video that I made from the Google Arts and Culture site. That's the Bruegel painting called The Harvesters. And if you zoom into the back, you can see a scene where there's people playing a game, some sort of ball game. I don't know exactly what game it is, but they're playing it with sticks, like a hockey kind of a game. But way in the background, almost microscopic, is the little shitter. It looks like he's shitting a little gold brick or something like that. He's also not really human, kind of, maybe, and there's a bird creature in front of him, but this happens in the backgrounds of these paintings. So anyway, I just thought you'd like to see that as a way of seeing the kinds of things that were in early art history that wouldn't be in our art histories today.